Hi everyone, you're here sewing with Cody. So in today's video, we are going to go over how to make our decorative stitches larger. We still have some restrictions due to the stitch width of our machine, but we're going to go over some different ways that we can kind of manipulate the machine the best that we can to make our stitches bigger. Alright, so remember, if you do enjoy this video at any point, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let's take a closer look at taking our decorative stitches and making them a little bit bigger. Alright, so here we are on the BERNINA 770, but this does apply to many of the other BERNINA machines, especially like our 7 series and our 5 series. I don't believe our 4 series actually has this capability, maybe the 480, but this is something that is found on some of the higher models of the machines. So let's see. So right now, like I said, I'm on the 770 and I have this flower design. So first I want to show you what it looks like just like a normal stitch, so we have that reference. So we'll come and stitch a few flowers. We can use our pattern end button. So what that would do is it will finish the pattern that we're working on, stop, and I have it set to tie off and cut my thread. So here we can look at my always little go-to flower. So this is the default size. So here we're dealing with a 9mm stitch width and its normal length, which is 14.6 millimeters wide from here to here. So there's one way that I'm sure it's clear to everyone of how to make our stitches bigger, and that's by coming to our stitch length and by stretching it out. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're just taking that pattern and stretching it out. So by default, we really can't change the stitch width, but we're able to change that stitch length. So we changed it from 14, which I believe was what it was, 14.6, and now we changed it to 36.5. So let's see what that looks like. We'll only do 2. Alright, so here is our new flower. So what's different about this flower is one, well, first of all, it's very big. And it pretty much looks just like the other one. But we can see it here on the screen. So we can see here on the screen, because remember, what we see on the screen with the BERNINA machine is everything's to scale. So we can see here we did just stretch out this pattern. We basically have the stitch length is what we stretched out, so we've got very long stitches. So we can see that here is we've got huge gaps between our needle penetrations. So that's fine, well and good, especially if we're working with like bobbin work, which is so much fun. We'll go over that in another video, and that would work great for bobbin work. But what it does is you've got these long stitches, so you can kind of lose some of the curvedness, some of the smoothness of the stitches. But if that's the look you're going for, then by all means, that's perfect. So there is another way. There is another. So if we have our flower, we can come to the eye and we can go to pattern elongation. So what this does is when we increase it, it makes the pattern bigger. So we increase it by 100%. So you can see that pattern is bigger. Let's see what it looks like when it stitches out. But one thing you can notice right away on the screen is as we made it bigger, it filled in those stitches. So we no longer just have like 3 or 4 stitches going from here across to here for that leaf. We've got a half dozen or so. So let's see what that looks like. So it increases it proportionally, essentially, and it fills in those stitches, so it's less likely to pucker because there's less tension going from those super long stitches, and the pattern just looks smoother. All right. So here you can see this is our new pattern. But if you look at it, those stitches, they're not big. I really can't get my little needle threader just barely underneath some of those stitches. So those stitches look nice and smooth, smoother than these do. It's a little bit smaller than this guy, but we can still increase that stitch length now. So we can still stretch it out, so we can make it significantly bigger, 73. So let's see what this looks like. I've stitched this one a little slower. And this one actually probably could benefit from having some stabilizer. So here we've got a really big flower. So what we did was we went to pattern elongation, which is found in the eye screen. We increased this particular pattern by 100%. So we went from here to here. So nice and smooth. And then we went from here to here by increasing the stitch length to its max, which for this particular pattern is 73.0 millimeters, and we've got a much bigger pattern. So with all of these patterns, regardless of it, if it looks like it or not, they're all 9 millimeters tall. So here's our default, which is 9 millimeters tall, and all three of these variants are also 9 millimeters tall, but this one does look significantly larger, and that's because it is. So there is something else. While we're talking about pattern elongation, that's kind of what this video is focused on. So every stitch has a different increase that we can do. So this one only allowed us to increase this particular pattern by 200%. So if we go and select a different pattern, let's say one of these satin stitches in stitch 400, folder 400, and we go and we say select this stitch. So this little satin wave, which by default is 17.9 millimeters long. But if I go to pattern elongation, you'll see the screen looks a little bit different. There's a little more going on here. So I could increase it by 100%, which is 200, 3, 4. I can go all the way up to 1,000. So we completely change the way, oops, went too far. So I completely changed the way the stitch looks. If we notice, the stitch is 178 millimeters long, which is 17.8 centimeters. 17.8 centimeters is a lot. That stitch is a little over 6.5 inches long. And one thing, as you notice, it kept that nice satin stitch. That's the purpose of using pattern elongation. But say if you just increased it by 100 to 200%, it made it bigger, but kept those satin stitches nice and full. Something that we can do differently, since we are dealing with a different class of stitches, is we can change the stitch density. So if you didn't want this to really be a satin stitch, I could just bring it back to default. So let's stitch it out to see what it looks like. I'm not really using the best foot I should be using. You should be using like a number 20 or another foot that has that raised center. But we can see what this stitch looks like by default. Perfect, right? So if we increase it by 100%, we can see what this stitch looks like. But all we did was increase it, the stitch length, basically the length of the stitch. That's all we really can change, by 100%. But there's something else we can do to give this stitch a totally different look. So here, this is two patterns, this is one pattern. So it would keep going if we let it. But we can change the density. We can either decrease it so to make it tighter, so we wouldn't really see any of the background of our white fabric, or we can increase that stitch length or decrease the stitch density basically, and we'll get a totally different, well, a different look. So if we were dealing with a different weight of fabric, we can adjust how this would stitch out and how it's going to look. So let's see what we got. So especially if we're working with like a thicker thread, we can really open this up. And if we were dealing with a heavier weight thread, say like a 30 weight, we could have this open up a little bit more. So like go up to like 0.55 or 0.6 and use a heavier thread, and it would look like hand embroidery, something that was done by hand, which will look really, really neat. So you can take this stitch and just completely alter it, all with pattern elongation. You really have a lot of options when it comes to manipulating your stitches, and this is something that Bernina prides themselves on. This falls under the category of total stitch control. So we have complete control over our stitches, unlike some other brands which will only allow you to make certain patterns a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. But here we can take any stitch and alter it however we want. Our only restrictions are mechanical restrictions. So for instance, like with a straight stitch, for instance, easy to start off with. So we have a straight stitch. I can make this stitch, the max, the width I can make it is 9 millimeters, because the foot opening and the stitch plate opening in feed dogs only allow for a 9 millimeter stitch width. So needle movement, which we do have 11 different needle positions. And then another thing is we can only extend this stitch length naturally to 6 millimeters, because the feed dogs can only move 6 millimeters forward and 6 millimeters backwards from that center needle, from that center position. So it can't move any further when progressing forward. So we're max at the 6 millimeter stitch length. There are some things we can do to kind of change that, but mainly just with a straight stitch. So we're limited with other stitches. So ways we can make our designs bigger is with pattern elongation and things like that. But with the total stitch control is we can come to any stitch, like our flower, and of course we have temporary alter stitch memory, so it remembers what we did. So if I just clear that out, so we can make this stitch as small as we want it, as long as we want it within the restrictions of mechanical feed dogs, of course. Other options would require us to do pattern elongation, but we can really change and manipulate our stitch, and with these screens we can really see it to scale, and it makes a huge difference. There is one more thing that we can do to make our patterns bigger, and this does allow us to make our patterns wider on the 7 series. Actually, a number of machines, but like the 790, we do have some other options, because we do have sideways motion, so those feed dogs can move in 720 different degrees, but this is on a 770, and the 790 feature is really only found on that and the 880. So there's something we can do. We can take this flower, we have it selected here, and if you have the embroidery function, we can come over to embroidery. I was doing my freestanding lace reindeer from last year. So I can go and I can select, come to my favorite folder, and it has brought over the flower. It brings over the last pattern that you were using. So I can bring it here. So here is my flower. So if I want, I can take that stitch and I can make it as big as my heart desires. So now we can start to stitch out sewing stitches that are significantly bigger than the 9 millimeter stitch width. So right now we're at 0.6 inches, which is about like 12 or so millimeters. So they're getting bigger. And then we can repeat those patterns to do a whole row. I did a sample with some Tula Pink stitches on the Tula Pink Special Edition machines, and I was able to do rows of them. So it looked like I sewed it on by the sewing machine using the feed dogs, but in actuality I brought them over to the embroidery side, lined them up, made them bigger, and I had these beautiful rows of Tula Pink limited edition decorative stitches that were significantly larger than the 9 millimeter stitch width max. So these are all the different ways. I may have missed one, but these are the majority, if not all the different ways that we can take our decorative stitches and make them bigger to better suit our sewing situation or our projects that we're working with. And the one exception will be with the 790 and the 880 sewing and embroidery machines. Those machines do have some mechanical differences from all of the rest, and we are able to really manipulate those stitches even more, including being able to draw our own stitches. All right, so if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Select the little bell in the below the video, which will give you instant notifications when new videos are uploaded. And as always, happy sewing.